Why did medieval Britain feel constantly on the edge of collapse? And why didn't it fall apart? We picture the Middle Ages as an age of mud, superstition, and endless war. But beneath the castles and crowns was a society experimenting, failing, and rebuilding itself again and again. This film traces medieval Britain from the wreckage of Roman rule to the threshold of the modern world. We'll follow invasions that should have ended kingdoms, plagues that erased entire communities, and rebellions that nearly broke royal authority. And yet, out of crisis came institutions that survived. In this documentary, we'll see how power was negotiated rather than imposed, how kings were forced to bargain, how law endured conquest, and how ordinary people gained leverage when disaster struck. From Norman England to the Black Death and beyond, medieval Britain was shaped less by stability than by stress. Understanding medieval Britain solves a bigger puzzle. The Middle Ages weren't a backward pause in history. They were a pressure cooker. And the systems forged under that pressure are the reason Britain didn't just survive the medieval world, but carried parts of it forward. When the last imperial detachments sailed away, towns did not collapse in a single season. They drifted into neglect as supplies from the continent stopped and payrolls ended. Councils lost authority without soldiers to enforce decrees, and workshops shut when orders dried up. Grain once moved over long roads to feed garrisons. With the state gone, those roads mattered less. Warehouses stood full of tools that no one paid to use. The urban rhythm slowed to a halt, then to scavenging. Roof tiles slid, timber rotted, and drains clogged. People preed iron cramps from walls and carted away stones for hearths. Public buildings became quarries because survival paid better than civic pride. Out beyond the old walls, fields still yielded crops, but the system that tied farm to town unraveled. Villas that had overseen estates lost their managers and guards. Tenants stayed if kin networks could protect them. They left if they could not. Markets shrank to seasonal fairs tied to harvests and saints' days where they survived at all. In some places, bathhouses housed animals. In others, basilicas became barns. The map of daily life moved from paved streets to trackways between scattered farmsteads. Without frontier troops, pressure mounted from every direction. Sea raiders tested rivers and estuaries. North of the old wall, groups long held back by payments and patrols found gaps. Local leaders gathered companions and pledged food and shelter in return for weapons and presents. Oaths and gifts replaced official postings. Law codes copied from Roman models fell out of use when no court could compel attendance. A man's safety depended on whose hall he could enter and whose favor he could keep. That logic shaped the fateful hiring of warriors from across the North Sea. They arrived as contract fighters settled near coasts and expected pay, meat, and land allotments. As yields failed or treasuries ran dry, disputes turned into clashes. Fortified farmsteads multiplied. The hired bands became neighbors and, soon enough, claimants. Settlements stretched inland along river valleys and light soils that took the plow well. The line between guest and master faded as children grew up not as auxiliaries, but as inheritors. Over 2 centuries, daily language shifted. Latin lingered in religious use and in a few estates that maintained scribes, yet most households spoke vernaculars that carried the law of the hall and the field. Written records thinned to rare inscriptions and occasional letters, while memory rested in recitations and precedent. Stone-built villas fell out of repair and were replaced by timber halls, fenced yards, and sunken huts used for weaving or storage. The material world signaled a new order with different priorities and know-how. Faith did not disappear. Western districts tied to older networks kept clerics, shrines, and holy places in use. Eastward, new gods received offerings near abandoned basilicas. Cemeteries mixed customs, urn cremations beside inhumations, with grave goods that marked status through blades, brooches, and beads. Seasonal rites mapped onto fields and feasts that mattered to small communities rather than to distant officials. Church sites endured where families guarded them and where travel routes still brought visitors. Power centered on halls. A chieftain's seat collected tribute in kind: grain, ale, hides, and labor, and distributed rewards. Justice came as compensation or feud, managed by assemblies that weighed kinship and reputation. Coinage fell out of circulation for generations. Trade moved through barter, tallies, and trust. Silver by weight mattered when it could be found, but most exchanges balanced goods and obligations set over shared meals. By around 600, no single conqueror had remade the island. The landscape changed through slow choices, migrations, and recalculations about safety and status. Old walls stood as landmarks without courts to back them. New place names took hold along rivers, ridges, and clearings. What had been a province became a patchwork of local powers, each anchored by a hall, a leader, and a circle of dependents whose world made sense within a day's walk. As settlement deepened, the countryside took on new boundaries. Clearings cut into woodland linked fields to paddocks and grazing, and hedges marked rights as much as fences did. Rivers and marsh edges served as frontiers between groups, and fords became habitual meeting spots. Villages clustered on lighter soils where the ard plow broke ground more easily, while heavier clays waited for later tools and teams. Paths followed ridgelines to avoid waterlogged lowlands. The landscape that once fed towns now fed halls, with outlying hamlets supplying grain, livestock, and craft goods to local centers that managed exchange. At the core stood the hall. It functioned as residence, government, storehouse, and stage. Retinues gathered for meals that structured obligation. Meat, ale, and gifts circulated to confirm who stood in favor. Poets recited deeds to knit memory and motivate future service. Winter feasts displayed wealth and hospitality, while smaller everyday meals kept the household running. The Lord offered security and justice. Followers offered labor and military service. Oaths framed the relationship, and breaking them risked exile or worse. Authority lived in that building, in its benches, its doors, and the weapons racked within. Across regions, distinct peoples coalesced into named polities. Groups that called themselves Angles, Saxons, and Jutes developed separate leadership lines and identities that mapped onto territories with shifting edges. New royal sites rose near old route junctions and river mouths that controlled movement. Competition for tribute routes and fertile river valleys drove campaigns that lasted a season or a generation. Borders flexed with marriages, alliances, and defeats, but the drive for advantage held steady. Fighting remained close and visible. Warbands mustered with shields of linden, spears of ash, and blades prized for steel quality and decoration. Leaders took risks at the front to display courage and win more hands for their households. Victory meant not just land, but status, captive labor, and the right to distribute plunder. Defeat disbanded followings and forced survivors to seek a new patron. Tactics favored shield walls, ambushes along river bends, and quick strikes at halls or storehouses before garrisons could gather. Belief shaped fields and graves alike. Offerings at pits, posts, and water sources asked for protection over crops, travel, and childbirth. Names of weekdays embedding Woden and Thunar carried devotion into timekeeping. Cemeteries show mixed rites, furnished inhumations with brooches, beads, blades, and buckles record rank and kin symbolism, while cremations speak to other traditions. Amulets, animal remains, and weapon placement marked hopes for power beyond death. Old sacred places endured next to new, forming layered sacred geographies. Language changed with generations. Speech drew from Germanic roots that set the foundation for daily terms. Household items, food, kinship, weather, and work. Place names multiplied in Old English elements that indicated meadows, clearings, enclosures, and streams, creating a living map of settlement. The spoken tongue carried law and farming knowledge where writing had thinned to rare inscriptions and imported texts. Over time, dialect zones formed, yet mutual intelligibility allowed trade and alliance across regions. Kingship relied on council. Assemblies of nobles and seasoned followers debated dues, land grants, and vengeance payments, and their consent lent weight to judgments. Disputes could end in compensation, oath-taking, or feud management overseen by elders. Gift-giving remained the mechanism that attached local elites to a wider framework. Without standing bureaucracies, advice and reputation kept coalitions intact. Death rituals reveal ideals of rule. Ship burials placed vessels on land and loaded them with insignia, armor, and goods from distant markets, turning the grave into a statement about command over people, objects, and stories. Such rites linked leaders to origin myths and seafaring prowess, anchoring legitimacy in memory as well as metal. By 800, networks tied coastal landing places to inland marts. Craft specialists worked glass, metal, and textiles for exchange beyond their villages. Silver arrived through trade and tribute, and elite centers coordinated movement of surplus. These links enriched courts and widened horizons, even as new sails edged the horizon with different claims. Power gathered around individuals who could turn followers into a framework. Leaders stitched together territories by force, oaths, and marriage, and loose communities became named realms with expectations of tribute and defense. A ruler's reach depended on who would answer his call and who would host him at a hall along the route. Alliances formed at feasts where land grants were read out, gifts displayed, and future campaigns planned. Rivalries sharpened when succession moved sideways through kin branches, and every death or defeat opened chances for neighbors to press claims. Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex rose in turn as their kings managed victories, marriages, and the custody of crucial river crossings. Northumbria drew strength from controlling routes between east and west, while Mercia leveraged the Midlands to tax movement across the heart of the island. Wessex, pushed along southern valleys and chalk downs, learned to consolidate slowly, preferring the patient addition of shires to flashy raids. Boundaries shifted with seasons of campaigning and were marked by ditches, woods, and streams that communities understood as lines of payment and patrol. Every change of frontier reallocated farms, labor, and the obligation to join a host. Courts moved with the king. The household rode a circuit that balanced display with collection, taking food renders, hearing disputes, and reissuing land in return for service. Royal residences multiplied rather than fixed on a single capital, and halls along the route became nodes where judgments were announced and charters witnessed. This mobility projected presence into each district and kept nobles dependent on royal favor for confirmation of their holdings. A leader seen in person secured obedience more effectively than decrees sent from afar. War decided who counted as king. Success drew men, and failure scattered them. A single bad season could peel away support as nobles calculated odds and shifted allegiance. Captives taken in raids supplied labor and leverage, while ransoms refilled treasuries. The display of spoils, standards, swords, imported goods, signaled competence to potential allies and warned rivals. In this climate, hesitation risked deposition, exile, or death at the hands of a grieved kin who claimed a better right. Lawgiving emerged as a tool to manage violence and rank. Early codes set payments for wounds, theft, and killing, fixing values by status and context. These schedules did not level society. They stabilized it by giving assemblies a table of amounts to enforce. Compensation prevented feuds from spiraling and clarified who owed what to whom. Written texts, where maintained, relied on recitation at gatherings so that memory and document reinforced each other. Gifts bound the political class. Rings, armlets, ornate swords, and parcels of land moved from king to retainer with public witness. The return payment came as service in war and steady support at assemblies. Treasure was not idle wealth. It was currency for loyalty. Land grants created a chain of obligation, since the recipient required his own followers to work, defend, and pass along a portion of proceeds. Ancestry strengthened claims. Lineages traced to legendary founders or divine figures framed rule as inheritance as well as achievement. This blend of myth and politics gave a gloss of inevitability to conquest and set expectations that sons, or brothers, could take up the same mantle. Titles and regalia echoed these stories, making every enthronement a renewal of origins as much as a transfer of authority. Mercia's dominance left few towering ruins. Its power shows instead in patterns of controlled roots, tribute, and subordinate rulers, underlining how authority could peak without grand stone statements. By 800, kingship had hardened into an institution recognized across regions, carried by moving courts, enforced by arms, and affirmed by law and gift. Strength brought neighbors to heel, and drew fresh rivals toward Britain's shores. Monasteries and emporia stacked wealth in forms raiders could carry. Silver objects, liturgical vessels, textiles, and people. In 793, the assault on Lindisfarne showed how exposed these sites were. Kings had focused on rivals and tribute routes. They had not built a perimeter against fleets that could appear at river mouths with the tide. Monastic settlements, placed for access to trade and isolation for prayer, sat close to landing places. Their storehouses and workshops concentrated value without walls or garrisons, inviting fast strikes that cut deep into the political fabric because gifts and learning flowed from these centers to courts. Early Scandinavian expeditions paired seamanship with reconnaissance. Crews tested estuaries, probed for fords and portages, and chose targets with an eye for profit and renown. They took silver and goods that could be divided on deck and captives who could be ransomed or sold abroad. Success bred imitation. Word of soft targets and rich yields traveled across the North Sea with returning ships. And the next season brought more hulls, more men, and leaders with reputations to make. Coastal communities adapted with lookouts and quick musters, but response times lagged behind sails and currents. By the 850s, the pattern shifted. Fleets arrived prepared to stay through winter. Fortified camps went up on river bends and promontories that controlled movement. Livestock taken nearby fed men who repaired ships and cast spearheads for spring. The great heathen army did not disperse after a raid. It marched inland, overwintered, and returned to the fight with fresh alliances. That tempo overwhelmed kingdoms built around seasonal campaigning. Defensive levies struggled to keep pace with forces that could redeploy by water faster than infantry could march. Northumbria fractured under pressure and factionalism. Its kings fell, and rival claimants lacked time to consolidate. East Anglia could not recover from the capture and killing of its ruler, and tribute arrangements turned into subordination. Mercia, once dominant, endured partitions and puppet rulers until it bowed to terms it could not enforce locally. The political map contracted as surviving elites sought safety under stronger neighbors or compromised with new masters. Towns that controlled bridges and crossings became prizes because whoever held them directed tolls, trade, and troop movement. Rivers became highways of invasion. The Thames opened the southeast, the Trent cut the Midlands, the Ouse led into Northumbria. Longships rode tides inland, linking coastal bases with nodal towns. Garrisons installed in these places drew supplies and tribute from hinterlands. Rather than depart with spring winds, many leaders parceled out land to followers. Farmsteads and hamlets with Scandinavian household heads emerged along good soils and existing field systems. Settlers brought their legal habits and assemblies, and they adapted them to local conditions. Justice and landholding followed different rules in these zones. Local things met in open air to hear disputes, set compensation, and decide inheritance within frameworks that differed from neighboring English customs. Oath-taking, sureties, and fines operated under terms grounded in Scandinavian usage. Governance thus changed at the level where people measured fields, married, and sued. Some towns minted coins under new authorities, stamping names and symbols that announced control and ensured payments moved in recognized forms. By 900, parts of England had been conquered and reorganized under leaders who taxed, judged, and settled. One southern kingdom remained with the means and leadership to coordinate resistance. The stage was set for a different kind of war. When Alfred came to the throne of Wessex in 871, he faced a kingdom boxed in by defeats. Viking armies had broken larger realms, and their winter camps cut the south from potential allies. Supplies ran thin, experienced warriors were dead or dispersed, and shires measured time by levies and losses. Alfred inherited a throne with fewer options and a population skeptical that any stand could hold. He fought, lost ground, and found that open battle favored fleets that could move as fast as rumors. Retreat took him to the marshes of Athelney. That landscape offered concealment, narrow approaches, and local guides who knew where to ford and where to vanish. Authority shrank to those who could still be reached by messengers moving through reeds and over causeways. Small strikes hit outposts, wagons, and foraging parties. Food and information mattered as much as blades. Loyal households stored provisions, sheltered envoys, and passed signals across the wetlands to keep the last network alive. From that base, Alfred rebuilt contact with neighboring shires. He sent word to reeves and thens to call the fired, the part-time levy, in short bursts that coincided with agricultural cycles. Muster points shifted to confuse scouts. He offered certainty where panic had ruled, clear times to gather, boundaries to defend, and penalties for those who failed to appear. Morale rose when men saw plans that matched their capacities. The aim was not a single showdown, but steady pressure and recovery of confidence. In 878, Alfred judged the moment right and marched to meet the Viking force near Edington. The fight forced the invaders to withdraw. Instead of chasing them into a ruinous pursuit, he pressed for terms that they could accept and he could enforce. The Viking leader Guthrum agreed to withdraw from Wessex-held land and enter a Christian rite that marked acceptance of a new political relationship. Hostages changed hands, and movement limits set boundaries that could be checked. The settlement created a working frontier. It gave farmers a planting season without sudden levies and allowed local courts to function within agreed lines. Trade routes reopened under guard. With constant raids reduced, Wessex recovered strength. Alfred used the breathing space to shift from reaction to prevention. He ordered the planning of fortified sites, burhs, at intervals that allowed defenders to move between them in a day. Each had a garrison obligation backed by land assessments that told every hideholder what labor, materials, and men he owed. Walls, ditches, and gates mattered, but so did roads that linked sites and watch systems that noticed sails or smoke. Markets moved inside these defenses, so wealth and people could not be snatched with a quick landing. Toll points collected revenue to sustain garrisons. Villagers learned routes to refuge and duties for repair. The net denied hostile armies the easy choice of wintering where they wished. Alfred also focused on governance and learning. He supported the use of a standard coin to stabilize payments and directed the translation of key texts into Old English so that instruction did not depend on rare Latin knowledge. Law introductions stressed measured judgment and the duty to weigh mercy, reinforcing the idea that rule rested on justice as much as on arms. These moves recruited the clergy and local elites into a shared project that went beyond survival. By 899, Wessex stood organized to fight, judge, and teach within one framework. Alfred left a country able to mobilize quickly, protect its towns, and explain its law in the language people spoke. And that foundation would carry his heirs further than defense alone. After the fighting eased, the northeast and east did not revert to old patterns. Authority settled into a structure where Scandinavian lords and farmers expected rule to work through local meetings open to free men. These gatherings spoke law aloud, named sureties, and decided fines in front of neighbors who would enforce the outcome. Rather than royal judges traveling a circuit, the weight of a verdict came from witnesses and the threat of shame or exclusion if someone refused compliance. Boundaries of districts formed around these meeting places, often on mounds, crossroads, or river bends that people already used as neutral ground. settlement looked different on the ground. Instead of compact nucleated villages, many districts showed scattered farmsteads with their own fields and stockyards, linked by lanes rather than a single main street. Strip fields still existed, but patterns shifted to suit households that worked separate blocks and negotiated access to meadows and pasture at assemblies. Hedged closes, small barns, and timber longhouses sat apart with outbuildings for drying grain and storing fodder. This layout allowed families to expand plots or split them between heirs without relocating, and it left a mosaic of holdings that later surveys still recorded in their odd shapes. Daily life blended quickly. Intermarriage joined kin groups, and fosterage created ties across language lines. Markets exchanged wool, salt fish, and iron tools alongside amber beads and wet stones that moved through North Sea routes. Farming practice shared techniques, manuring regimes, crop rotations, and the selection of hardy barley and rye for marginal soils. Boat building know-how improved inland craft as settlers who knew fjords adapted to tidal rivers and shallow creeks. Hospitality obligations crossed communities, so a guest right extended protection no matter which tongue they used at home. Language shifted in small, steady steps. Old Norse terms slipped into speech where they filled needs, words for law and meeting, parts of boats, winds and skies, and everyday objects inside a house. People used the plainer of two synonyms that meant the same thing, and those stuck. Children raised in mixed households grew up code switching at the hearth and in the field. Over time, these blends leveled dialect edges so that traders and travelers could work across former frontiers without an interpreter. The map announced these changes. New farmsteads and hamlets took names ending in "by" for a farm, "thorp" for an outlying settlement, and "thwaite" for a clearing. Streams, slopes, and fields picked up labels that combined Old English with Norse, showing joint use rather than conquest alone. These names endured because they answered practical questions. Who lived there? What land it was? And what work it supported. Customs within the Danelaw also shaped who could own and move property. Women's claims to dowry and widow's portion received guarded recognition in some districts, and assemblies enforced returns when families disputed transfers. That made marriage contracts more than private promises. They became public instruments tied to land and livestock. While practice varied by place, the presence of these protections stood out compared with neighboring shires. Church life adapted. Stone cross shafts and grave markers in several parishes carried interlace with beasts and motifs that drew from both traditions. Carvers set knotwork around crucifixion scenes or framed saints with dragonesque heads, hinting at artisans and patrons comfortable with shared symbols. Clergy worked with lay leaders to regularize baptisms and tithes, while accepting that feast days and processions might run alongside older seasonal observances. By mid-century, this region worked as a hybrid zone. People paid dues, traded, married, pled, and worshipped through routines that felt normal to them, even if they differed from habits farther south and west. When royal power reached back across these districts, it met communities already practiced in organized decision-making and accustomed to clear measures for land, weight, and payment. That experience would ease later unification rather than resist it. Stability gave the West Saxon court time to plan. The defenses Alfred left, burhs, musters, and roads. let his successors push beyond survival. They moved the frontier outward rather than waiting for raids to come to them. Garrisons learned fixed duties, reeves kept tallies of labor owed for walls and ditches, and royal messengers carried orders that could be enforced the same week they were issued. The aim was steady pressure. Deny hostile armies easy wintering, interfere with their supplies, and replace temporary garrisons with permanent authority. Edward the Elder coordinated campaigning with his sister, Ethelfled, who governed Mercia from a network of fortified centers. They advanced in linked stages. A new fort went up to guard a river crossing. Then another sealed a road behind it. Each move pulled farms and small markets into a safer orbit. Instead of gambling on one decisive clash, they forced opponents to fight over ground already prepared for defense. If a Viking warband broke in, it found short routes cut, bridges held, and nearby burhs able to reinforce each other within a day's march. Every stronghold served two roles. It housed troops and also counted rents, stored grain renders, and hosted courts. Officials weighed silver, checked measures, and stamped authority on trade. Storehouses stood beside mint workshops and smithies, so military needs and local commerce backed each other. When a district submitted, scribes recorded dues, and the same gate that barred raiders collected tolls from merchants. The wall protected both the ledger and the granary. Absorbing former Danelaw regions required compromise. West Saxon rulers understood that landholding families who had prospered under Scandinavian customs could either rebel or cooperate. They chose cooperation where possible. A local leader who swore loyalty kept his estates and gained confirmation under royal charter. In return, he accepted new muster obligations, coinage, and judgment under mixed law. This approach reduced the cost of garrisoning and turned potential rivals into stakeholders who now had something to lose if disorder returned. Pressure focused on strategic towns. Control of crossing points on the Trent, Severn, and Ouse narrowed the movement of hostile forces. As lines tightened, trading places aligned with West Saxon mints, and the flow of silver began to show royal names and symbols. When York finally came under West Saxon influence, the last large Scandinavian power center within England's borders shifted from independent kingmaking to negotiated submission. That pivot removed a rallying point for resistance and opened northern routes to inspection, tolls, and law. With territory came a change in language of rule. Charters started to frame authority in broader terms, presenting the king as ruler of all the English rather than of a southern people only. Royal courts summoned witnesses from multiple shires. Law codes circulated with prefaces that stressed peace across mixed communities. The king's progress extended farther, and assemblies drew nobles whose status depended on royal confirmation more than on local acclaim. Coinage tied these gains together. Standard types appeared across the realm, weights aligned, and dies spread between mints so that a penny struck in one town passed without question in another. Traders could plan long routes with fewer exchanges by weight. Officials could assess taxes in a recognizable unit. As currency stabilized, market days multiplied inside burh walls and toll records climbed. Amid this consolidation, Ethelfled stood out. A woman directing building programs, garrisons, and campaigns within a warrior culture showed that competence could override expectation. Towns answered her summons. Forts rose on her orders. Her leadership gave Mercia a partner's voice rather than a subject's whisper, which made the joint advance with Wessex quicker and more reliable. By 1016, the apparatus built since Alfred, fortified places, mobile levies, standardized money, and a broader idea of kingship, had turned a threatened house into the leading power on the island. Its wealth, order, and reach drew attention from abroad, and with attention came claims that would test how strong those foundations truly were. The calm that followed the rise of Wessex gave way to confusion the moment Edward the Confessor died without a settled heir. Rival claims hardened fast. Harold Godwinson moved first, taking the crown with the backing of leading nobles and the machinery of rule in his hands. Yet his authority faced immediate threats from opposite horizons. Across the North Sea, the Norwegian king prepared an expedition with English exiles as guides. Across the Channel, William of Normandy argued his own right to succeed and gathered ships, horses, and men trained for coordinated land-sea war. Harold could not sit and wait. News from the north forced him to act at speed. He marched the corps of his housecarls and a levy of thegns toward Yorkshire, covering distance in days that strained men and supply. The fight that followed was hard and close, and Harold's force prevailed, but victory cost time and strength. Casualties thinned ranks. The march had burned through food and rest. Messengers still rode to collect stragglers when fresh reports said sails had appeared on the southern coast. William had chosen his moment. He landed on beaches with sheltered access, unloaded cavalry and archers, and secured a base for supplies. Harold turned his army south again, forcing another punishing march that left little margin for planning. The two hosts met near Hastings on ground where slopes and ditches mattered. The English formed a shield wall around their standards, relying on discipline, axes, and spears. The Normans brought archers, infantry, and mounted knights trained to press and regroup without breaking. The day wore on as assaults tested the English line. Arrows probed gaps, feigned retreats tried to loosen steadiness. Repeated charges worked to tire men holding heavy shields. Slowly, pressure told. As units faltered, the defense took wounds it could not absorb. Harold fell in the crush, and leaders around him died in the final pushes. With the king gone, cohesion collapsed. The field turned from contest to rout, and the ruling corps that had bound shires to crown fell with it. William did not find a quiet kingdom waiting. Resistance flared along his route. He advanced carefully, punishing centers that fought and sparing those that opened gates. He sought recognition, but he also demonstrated reach. Columns moved to secure crossing points and roads, and supply lines back to the coast stayed guarded. Where he paused, he left garrisons behind barriers thrown up quickly. One advantage came from preparation. Crews had ferried timber frames across the channel as kit. These parts assembled into Motte and Bailey castles in days rather than months. A mound, a palisade, a ditch, and a keep created a local command post that dominated routes and markets. From these bases, detachments could raid, collect dues, and watch for uprisings. Towns learned the terms: offer hostages and provisions and keep your privileges, or hold out and face fire and loss. Through the final months of 1066, William tightened control one district at a time. He sought a crown at a recognized center to translate force into legal claim, while his captains enforced the new order on the ground. Land grants began to shift to men who had crossed with him. displacing families bound to the old regime. By year's end, the realm did not simply wear a new monarch. Authority now ran through a foreign aristocracy whose methods, courts, and military habits would recast how power worked from shire to village. William secured the crown and moved quickly to rework ownership. Lands that had anchored Anglo-Saxon families for generations passed into Norman hands through forfeiture, grants, and exchanges tied to service. The king held the power to confirm or revoke holdings, so loyalty flowed upward. Earls who once acted as regional magnates found their titles hollowed out, replaced by clusters of estates granted to men whose fortunes depended on royal favor. This transfer severed local networks and tied wealth to obedience rather than heritage. Centralization followed the property shift. William asserted ultimate lordship over land and framed every tenancy as a holding from the crown. Even the greatest barons owed defined military service and counsel in return for their estates. Oaths ran directly to the king, cutting across intermediate loyalties. When disputes arose, confirmations and charters settled them with the monarch as final arbiter. This structure reduced fragmentation and made taxation and musters calculable. Authority no longer scattered across independent regional courts. It converged on the royal household and its clerks. The new ruling class spoke French in halls, courts, and documents. Legal terms, household ranks, and words for government entered elite speech while most people continued to speak English at home and in the fields. Over time, bilingual practice shaped records and law, mixing vocabulary and, gradually, style. Bishops, sheriffs, and reeves navigated both idioms to manage levies, corvées, and market rights. Language marked status, but practical administration required translation at every level. To hold ground, Norman lords managed tightly integrated estates. Manors aligned fields, mills, woodland, and labor obligations to capture surplus. Rents in kind, labor days on demesne, and court fines fed lordly incomes and funded garrisons, retinues, and building works. Watermills multiplied as landlords enforced suit to mill, converting grain to fees. Forests were reserved as hunting grounds and revenue sources under new regulations that imposed heavy penalties. Extraction became predictable, recorded, and enforceable. Resistance did not end at Hastings. Uprisings erupted in the north and west, and in the fens, where difficult terrain offered refuge. The response came as deliberate devastation, dismantling the material base of rebellion. Fields were burned, stores destroyed, and settlements reduced to prevent regrouping. After punishment, castles anchored control. Timber and stone keeps rose over river crossings, ports, and boroughs, giving small garrisons leverage over movement and trade. As fighting ebbed, kings extended rule through paperwork and routine. Royal clerks produced writs that standardized commands to sheriffs. Accounts tracked renders and aids. Surveys mapped obligations and holdings, clarifying who owed service and who possessed what by grant or inheritance. Record-keeping made revenue less dependent on personal relationships and more on known quotas. Administration turned offices into tools that worked even when the king rode elsewhere. Royal justice widened its reach. The crown reserved serious offenses and offered a forum for suits that crossed shire lines or touched royal rights. Sheriffs convened shire and hundred courts under watchful oversight, while itinerant justices inspected procedure and profits. Fees, amercements, and fines supplied income and reinforced habit. People sought royal remedy because it worked and because ignoring it carried cost. By 1086, a realm-wide inquest listed lands, holders, resources, and dues, allowing the king to audit power and profit. In the decades that followed, this system matured. By the mid-12th century, conquest had shifted into governance backed by castles, clerks, and coin, producing a country wealthier, more ordered, and accustomed to power that spoke from the center. Norman power had to be visible. Castles supplied that visibility in timber and earth first, then in stone. After 1066, work crews cut ditches and heaped mounds in days, not seasons, throwing up motte and bailey sites at ports, bridgeheads, and road junctions. A palisade around a yard, a tower on the mound, and a gate facing a guarded route signaled that orders would be issued here and obeyed. These new structures marked a chain of occupation across the map, stitching the coast to inland towns and turning landscapes into fields of watchfulness. Speed mattered. Timber let lords claim ground while the memory of battle remained fresh. A garrison could move in while the ditch still held wet clay. Carpentry teams raised towers with pre-cut joints and local labor, compelled by obligation, hauled brush, stakes, and sod. Within weeks, a commander could store grain, shelter horses, and post lookouts over a river bend or causeway through fenland. The build itself created a levy of effort that reminded nearby settlements who now directed work, time, and tolls. Placement followed function. Castles stood where roads crossed, ferries landed, and markets gathered, so patrols could intercept carriers and collect dues. A single bailey might enclose a mint workshop, a granary, and a holding pen for livestock seized as fines. From these yards, mounted detachments rode circuit, checked weights and measures, and escorted tax silver toward royal treasuries. The structure did not only block enemies, it organized everyday movement so that trade and travel flowed under watch. Small, trained garrisons made this system efficient. A few dozen men-at-arms with archers and servants could hold a gate, man towers, and ride out in shifts. They knew drill, watched for signals from beacon hills, and used written orders carried by messengers. With relay points secured, a small foreign elite could oversee large districts. Because the castle multiplied their presence through fear of quick reprisal and the certainty of record-keeping that followed any dispute. As rule settled, timber gave way to stone. Keeps rose with thick walls, narrow stairs, and controlled entries. Rebuilding in stone announced that authority was not temporary. Masonry resisted fire, weather, and siege engines better than plank and palisade. It also fixed the castle's outline into the town plan. Streets bent to skirt outer walls. Markets shifted to fit new gates. Houses clustered where soldiers spent pay. The keep's height provided line of sight to other towers along ridges and rivers, extending the web of surveillance. Administration found a home inside these perimeters. Lords' courts met in great halls to hear pleas, levy amercements, and record transfers of land. Clerks tallied renders of grain and coin. Prison cells held debtors and rebels until fines were paid or sentences carried out. When trouble flashed, stores of quarrels, spare bowstrings, and sheaves waited in armories, and the alarm brought gates slammed, bridges raised, and messengers sent to draw support from neighboring sites. For villagers and townsfolk, the castle shaped daily rhythms. Curfews matched the locking of outer doors. Market days moved under the shadow of a wall where tolls could be demanded and checked. The sightline of the keep appeared from fields and alleyways, a constant cue that judgments, taxes, and musters lay close at hand. Protection claims mattered less than presence. The structure signaled who commanded space and sanctioned punishment. Placement often carried a message. Builders chose mounds at former assembly fields and edges of earlier royal sites, overlaying old gathering places with new enclosures. That choice replaced open negotiation grounds with gated precincts, shifting community decision-making into lordly courts. By 1200, these fortifications had reworked terrain and habit. Castles fixed power onto high points and river loops, taught people where authority lived, and made control part of the built environment. Conquest hardened into habit, and habit became structure. Land defined status, and obligation defined relationships. The king granted large blocks of territory to magnates on terms that tied their fortunes to his summons. A gift of land came with the expectation of mounted men, armor, and food rents to support them. Those grants broke into smaller parcels held by tenants who owed service up the chain. The result was a ladder that reached from royal halls down to village greens, where dues, labor, and judgment were counted. At the top, nobles held their estates in exchange for military aid. Service meant a set number of nights for a set number of days, plus the costs to equip and maintain them. When a campaign ended, the obligation did not. Lords still had to staff garrisons, keep horses, and maintain stores. To pay for this, they organized manors to produce predictable surpluses. Mills, ovens, and wine press rights became monopolies that turned grain and grapes into fees. Woodland, pasture, and fish weirs were measured and reserved by custom, and trespass carried fines. Below them, lesser lords managed the everyday machinery. Stewards, bailiffs, and reeves enforced calendar labor. Plowing, sowing, weeding, and reaping. On demesne fields, and they called extra teams for haymaking or carting timber. They ran manorial courts that fixed penalties, recorded transfers, and assigned strips after inheritance or marriage. Custom guided most decisions. A tenant knew which day he owed to the lord's meadow and which to hedging the outer fields, even if no parchment spelled it out. Oral rules witnessed by neighbors carried legal weight. Most people worked the open field system. Families held narrow strips scattered across large fields, so risk spread across soils and slopes. Common meadows and shared pasture supported cattle and sheep after harvest. In return, peasants turned up for boon works, paid rents in grain or hens, and surrendered small sums at set times. Access to a bakehouse, a mill, or woodland for fuel came with obligations attached. The village watched compliance, because one person's failure could unsettle the crop rotation or the upkeep of boundary banks. Birth set expectations. A child born to unfree parents inherited the same status, and dues followed the holding rather than the person's ambition. Marriage often stayed within neighboring parishes, and lifetime travel rarely exceeded the circuit of a few markets. Movement did happen. Craft workers, peddlers, and servants circulated. But the bulk of the population lived out lives within the bounds of the manor and its churchyard, where lineage and land tied together. Personal oaths held the rungs of the system. Homage and fealty were sworn in front of peers, with hands joined and words repeated. The ceremony created a public memory of duty, and breaking it risked dispossession, fines, or worse. The bond traveled in both directions. A lord owed protection and maintenance. A tenant owed service and counsel. When disputes arose, witnesses recalled terms and days, and the court enforced the balance with amercement scaled to rank. Over time, money crept into these relationships. Cash rents replaced some labor days, especially where markets grew and coin moved more freely. Commutation let a tenant pay to avoid peak season works, and it pushed estate managers to hire labor when and where needed. This shift loosened direct supervision without erasing hierarchy, and it made tallies, weights, and measures central to control. For many villagers, the lord remained a figure known by name, not by presence. Officials collected dues, heard pleas, and oversaw harvest tallies. By 1300, the order looked firm, yet rising costs, wage pressures, and tax demands pressed against its limits. Daily life ran to a religious rhythm. Birth meant baptism, and a name entered into a parish memory. Marriage required a blessing and public consent. Death brought bells, prayers, and earth set aside as consecrated ground. The church sat in the middle of those moments, not as an occasional visitor, but as the body that supplied witnesses, certified vows, and marked time with services that framed the week and the year. Confession taught language for fault, and penance mapped out steps toward repair. Stone churches stood at the heart of settlements. Their towers called people together for worship and for meetings where dues were announced, bylaws repeated, and disputes aired before neighbors. Churchyards served as markets on feast eves and as courts for oaths taken over holy relics. The building guided behavior by presence. Doors set open at daylight, altars dressed for saints' days, and porches used for contracts and betrothals. Parish tithes maintained fabric and clergy, while guilds adopted altars to sponsor candles and funerals. Control of writing gave clergy leverage. Rectors and monks kept account rolls, drafted charters, and copied homilies that traveled between pulpits. A boy sent to a song school learned letters through psalms, then moved to Latin grammar and reckoning by Roman numerals. Manor officials depended on clerks to tally rents and fines. Kings needed literate servants to issue writs. In a countryside where most people measured memory by witness, the church preserved names, boundaries, and rights in ink that outlived a generation. At the top, bishops and abbots managed wide estates. Their granges supplied grain, wool, and fish, and their tenants owed the same labor and rents demanded by lay lords. Monasteries fielded armed retainers to protect property, and episcopal courts drew litigants with claims that crossed shire lines. These leaders answered to Rome on doctrine and discipline, which gave them an authority that bypassed local magnates and even the king, especially in disputes over appointments and revenues. The calendar carried theology into work. Advent and Lent cut meat from diets and slowed weddings. Easter and Pentecost opened marriage seasons and trade fairs. Rogation processions walked field boundaries, blessing crops while reaffirming lines that mattered for rents. Harvest Thanksgivings, Marian feasts, and patron saint days set breaks in labor that everyone recognized, from reeve to reeves man. Time itself wore church marks. Fear and hope directed conduct. Sermons warned against theft, false measure, and violence. They promised forgiveness in exchange for confession, restitution, and amendment. Parish penance tables assigned fasts or alms for particular offenses, and public atonement restored standing. The mechanism worked because neighbors saw it enacted, and because eternity gave weight to each act in a way secular penalties could not. Pilgrimage made devotion mobile. People set out to shrines for healing, penance, or a vow, kept carrying tokens home to prove the journey. Inns, bridges, and chapels grew along routes, and merchants followed the same paths with cloth, salt, and books. A trip bound villagers to distant cults and brought news, styles, and stories back to the parish. Tension with kings and nobles surfaced often. Crowns sought revenue and influence over bishoprics. Churchmen defended rights to elect, tax exemptions, and legal privilege. Compromise produced written settlements, but contests returned with each vacancy or levy. Inside, churches glowed with color. Walls held saints, last judgments, and parables in paint that taught the illiterate and refreshed the learned. By 1400, parish, priory, and cathedral formed a web that unified belief and habit, strong enough to rival royal command and shape what obedience looked like. The silence after Rome did not last. By the 12th century, monasteries and convents stood across Britain like fixed points in a shifting landscape, offering ordered lives shaped by prayer, work, and study. They drew in children given as oblates, nobles seeking patronage, and layfolk who came for aid or judgment. Walls signaled separation from the world, but gates stayed busy. Hospitality rules required feeding travelers, housing the poor, and caring for the sick. So a monastery's day unfolded alongside the needs of the region around it. Daily routine imposed rhythm on bodies and minds. Bells called communities before dawn for the first service, then again at set intervals until night. Hours between prayers filled with tasks: tending herds, brewing ale, teaching novices, repairing roofs, and copying texts. A cellarer managed supplies, a kitchener oversaw food, an infirmer organized care for the ill. A porter kept order at the gate. Silence governed certain spaces, gestures replaced chatter, and each role supported the whole. The point was predictability. A timetable that steadied life when seasons, wars, and prices shifted without warning. Inside the scriptorium, writing became preservation. Monks copied liturgical books for worship, but also recorded chronicles, saints' lives, and practical treatises. They reused scarce parchment by scraping older texts, but many works survived because copying never stopped. Illuminators added initials and diagrams that guided reading as much as they decorated pages. Margins filled with notes, corrections, and small drawings that show how readers argued with the text while they worked. Libraries grew into catalog collections, arranged so a prior could find what he needed when teaching or settling disputes. Innovation did not stop at the page. Many houses experimented with drainage ditches, mills, fish ponds, and water channels that powered hammers, fulling stocks, and grindstones. Record-keeping improved estate management. Field rotations tracked yield, rent rolls listed tenants and dues, and cartularies gathered charters so property claims could be defended. Gardens supplied herbs for cooking and basic medicine. Workshops produced candles, leather goods, and tools. Monasteries became local hubs where skill, labor, and planning came together. Convents followed similar rules and offered rare paths for women to study. Noble families placed daughters there for safety, education, and influence. Nuns managed estates, hired stewards, and exchanged letters with other houses. They read scripture and learned Latin basics for chant. Some oversaw teaching for girls from nearby communities. The routine bound them to prayer, but administration demanded careful accounting, negotiation with neighbors, and oversight of farmland and mills that supported the house. Wealth accumulated through gifts of land, rents, and rights to collect tithes. Pilgrims left offerings. Patrons endowed altars and chantries. Successful estates returned surpluses to the house. This success increased reach, but it also drew criticism. When buildings expanded and tables improved, rivals questioned whether vows of poverty still guided conduct. Some houses responded with reform, tightening observance and limiting luxury. Others struggled to balance devotion and administration. Music bound communities across distance. Systems of notation standardized chant so a melody learned in one house matched the sound in another. Lines, neumes, and signs fixed pitch and rhythm well enough for singers to keep to the same path, turning oral tradition into a shared written practice. This made training faster and consistent, and it tied scattered houses into a single audible culture. By 1300, monastic schools and libraries fed into a broader world of learning. Clerks trained in grammar and logic moved between cloister and town, carrying methods of reading, disputing, and recording that shaped teaching beyond the walls. The habits of copying, cataloging, and scheduling formed routines that later university scholars would recognize. Even as new debates pushed study out of chapter houses and into lecture halls. While cloisters trained minds and managed estates, towns pulled people in for different reasons: steady work, cash wages, and the promise of movement. As fields yielded more grain and livestock, carts rolled more often, roads saw repairs, and ferries kept regular hours. New suburbs spread outside crumbling walls, and small settlements beside bridges, fords, and crossroads swelled into boroughs. Strangers arrived with accents from other shires, and households shifted away from farming rhythms toward the tempo of markets and toll gates. A porter at a town gate could count prosperity by the line of pack horses before dawn. Market days remade the week. Stalls went up before first light, and wardens checked weights, measures, and stall fees. Bakers sold loaves by the dozen, tanners traded hides, and drovers pushed cattle through lanes set aside for livestock. Civic officers walked the busiest streets to prevent fights and to seize spoiled goods. Disputes over change, counterfeits, or short measure went before the town court before sunset. Seasonal fairs multiplied the scale. Annual charters permitted weeks of duty-free trade, drawing sellers who camped outside the walls and filled fields with tents and pens. Merchants stitched English towns into distant circuits. Fleets carried wool to ports in Flanders and returned with wine from Gascony, fine cloth, tin-glazed jugs, and small bags of pepper that turned stews into status symbols. Account books tracked credit across months, so a deal in April could be settled after the shearing in June. Brokers matched distant buyers and local producers, and customs officers took their share at bridges and quays. Warehouses near the river doubled as offices, and the width of a quay told visitors how much trade a town commanded. Craft production concentrated where customers stood close. In one lane you could find a row of forges, each with a smith trained by a master in that street. In another, weavers hung newly fulled cloth to dry above a ditch fed by a mill race. Bakers shared ovens under supervision that reduced fire risk and kept loaves consistent. Stonecutters worked near building sites, following marks that identified each team's output for payment. Shared water, fuel, and transport made neighborhoods of trades, and knowledge passed across doorways at the end of each day. Guilds gave these clusters rules and leverage. Apprentices signed years of service, learned the craft, and slept over the shop. Journeymen traveled to build experience and saved for the fee that bought a place as a master. Statutes set work hours, prices, and materials, and wardens inspected workshops to protect the guild's reputation. Burial funds, feast days, and support for widows bound members into a brotherhood that could lend money, lobby the council, and enforce discipline when standards slipped. That security had edges. Entrance fees, family connections, and residency rules limited who advanced. Women sold ale, made bread, spun, and kept shops, but the best-paid crafts often blocked them from mastery. Migrants faced extra hurdles or found a place only in new or marginal trades. Licenses and freeman status mattered, and those without them rented stalls at higher rates, or worked on the edge of the market where oversight ran thin. Town governments took shape as prosperity grew. Councils of aldermen, bailiffs, and mayors set bylaws, collected tolls, and negotiated charters that reduced seigneurial control. Wealthy merchants gained offices, adjudicated disputes, and hired watchmen to enforce curfews and fire rules. Streets stayed loud and bright. Iron-shod wheels on cobbles, hawkers' cries, geese and pigs underfoot, braziers smoking at corners, and painted signs swinging above shop fronts. By 1400, money and skill spoke clearly. Contracts traveled faster than oaths, and councils argued policy without waiting on a lord's rider. The pull of wages, credit, and craft pride kept doors open long after the bell, and that habit of self-rule carried into every deal struck at the scales. Away from the noise of markets, most people worked land that tied them to weather and soil. The year set the terms. In late winter, families mended tools and hedges. Spring meant plowing shared strips with oxen teams, sowing barley and oats, and cleaning drainage ditches so fields would not flood. Summer called for weeding and haymaking. Harvest came fast. Men, women, and children moved in lines, cutting, binding, and carting sheaves before rain. Afterward, they gleaned leftover grain, then turned to autumn plowing and sowing wheat on better ground. Fallow strips rested under grazing animals whose manure kept soil from failing. Labor never fell on one set of shoulders. Households sent workers to the Demson fields to meet weekly labor dues, then hurried back to their own plots. When the Lord's steward called for boon works at harvest, the village answered. Ale and bread sweetened the obligation, but refusal risked fines. Common rights mattered: access to woodland for fuel, to pasture for a few pigs or a cow, and to streams for watering made survival possible. Disputes over a hedge line or a broken cart axle went before the manor court, where custom acted as law and neighbors testified to what had always been done. Homes stayed small. Wattle and daub walls, a thatch roof, an open hearth, and an earth floor filled most cottages. Smoke drifted through a louver or the thatch, leaving soot on rafters that actually helped resist rot. Families slept on straw pallets and stored grain in chests. Tools hung from beams to keep them dry. In winter, a goat or a pair of chickens shared the space to keep warmth in and theft out. Repair work happened constantly, patching roofs after storms, smearing fresh clay on walls, and lifting floors to sweep out damp. Meals repeated the seasons. Bread made from mixed grains anchored the diet, and pottage simmered with leeks, peas, or cabbage-filled bowls each day. On fast days, fish and dairy replaced meat. On feast days, a household might share a salted joint or a fresh chicken. And honey sweetened special occasions. Brewing small ale provided safe drink and calories, so a cask stood in many homes, replenished as grain allowed. Salt, fuel, and mill fees ate into any surplus, and a bad harvest could force the sale of a pig or tools to buy grain. Hard years brought threats into focus. A late frost could kill seedlings. A wet summer could flatten crops. A cattle disease could strip a family of strength and wealth in a week. Illness spread quickly in crowded homes, and simple injuries from tools or animals turned dangerous without skilled care. Parish alms and charity from a local house offered some relief, but hunger stretched habits thin. People adjusted by planting hardy legumes, sharing seed, and shifting labor to crafts in winter, making baskets, shoes, or nails for sale at the nearest market. Children learned by doing. A boy drove geese, scared birds from fields, and carried water before he could handle a plow. A girl fed animals, spun thread, and kept the hearth going before she could see over a table. Formal schooling stayed rare, but skill passed along tasks. How deep to set a coulter, how to judge grain by feel, when to sow by the moon or by the soil's warmth. Evenings carried memory. Songs, tales of saints, riddles, and local histories moved from mouth to mouth, setting values and recalling floods, fires, and fair judgments. By 1400, life remained narrow in means but broad in work. Every tithe, rent, and market day rested on the fields that kept towns and lordships alive. Power and land bound nobles to war. A lord's authority rested on the ability to raise men, pay them, and maintain fortifications. His hall displayed arms as much as tapestries, and his court days doubled as musters where service was counted and arrears noted. Military obligations shaped rents, marriages, and alliances because every grant of land implicated mounted service or cash to hire those who would ride in the Lord's name. Training began early. Boys fostered in another household learned to handle horses, carry messages, and serve at table while watching how orders moved through a retinue. Page became squire. Squire learned to care for armor, tilt with blunted lances, and fight on foot with spear and shield when horses failed. Wrestling, archery, and hunting built strength and discipline. Instruction also covered command, how to keep files dressed on a march, how to post watches, and how to read a landscape for ambush or cover. Mounted warfare demanded wealth. A warhorse cost more than many villagers would see in a lifetime. And a second or third mount protected the main charger from exhaustion. Mail, then plate pieces over time, required maintenance and a smith's skill to keep links tight and dents hammered out. Lances splintered often. Swords had to be ground and rehilted. Saddles, stirrups, and high-back seats stabilized a rider's body so impact transferred through wood and leather, not bone. Campaigns rarely climaxed in set-piece battles. Raids burned barns, cut vines, seized livestock, and forced an opponent to negotiate from shortage. Small forces harried bridges and mills, denied access to pasture, and intercepted wagons. When resistance centered on a strong point, siegecraft took over. Engineers raised timber towers, dug mines under walls, and rolled mangonels into range to break battlements or morale. Water and food mattered more than valor. A garrison calculating barrels in a cellar knew how many weeks it could stand. Castles anchored this system. A motte and bailey thrown up in days could hold a crossing or a road. Later, stone keeps and curtain walls signaled money able to endure. Gatehouses concentrated defense where visitors entered, and a small garrison could control a wide hinterland by patrolling roads and receiving hostages. Lords ran courts inside these walls, stored grain from demesne lands, and held prisoners whose fates could fund the next campaign. Chivalry set standards for conduct and identity. Ceremonies at dubbing stressed loyalty to lord, church, and community. And codes praised restraint in victory and protection for the unarmed. Tournaments trained bodies and cemented alliances through spectacle. In practice, commanders balanced honor with results. They timed attacks to avoid storms, negotiated safe conducts to move baggage, and used scouts to test for weak points before committing heavy riders. Armies changed across the period. Feudal summons still called men for limited terms, but lords hired sergeants, archers, and crossbowmen for wages to extend campaigns. Contracts specified pay, rations, and shares of booty. Mercenaries brought experience from other wars and accepted orders without the fragile ties of kinship. Infantry drilled with longer pikes and worked with archers to blunt cavalry, while sappers and carpenters turned timber into bridges and siege engines overnight. Ransom shaped outcomes among elites. Capturing a knight or baron promised payment tied to rank, heraldry, and estates. So combatants aimed to unhorse and hold rather than kill. Bonds, hostages, and sealed agreements moved money across borders and seasons later, keeping conflict profitable for those who survived. By 1400, war required cash, logistics, and records. Ledgers tracked wages, tallies counted arrows, and contracts replaced old vows on campaign. The cost of keeping men in the field pushed lords to squeeze estates harder or to bargain with towns for subsidies, tying military ambition to fiscal skill as tightly as to courage. Power shifted from feud to forum as kings tightened their grip on justice. Local blood feuds did not vanish overnight, but royal writs began to set the pace. Sheriffs summoned men to 100 courts, bailiffs collected fines, and constables kept watch on bridges and markets. The crown's interest was clear. Peace brought revenue, order showed authority, and disputes moved from barns and churchyards into rooms where officials recorded what happened. Lords still held their own courts for land and custom, Yet the king reserved serious crimes and matters that touched his peace. To make reach into reality, royal judges rode regular circuits. They arrived with commissions, open sessions in shire towns, and heard a mix of thefts, assaults, property disputes, and accusations against officials themselves. A visit meant business. Jurors were sworn, indictments read out, and amercements assessed for towns that failed to produce accused persons. These tours bound distant regions to a single procedure. So a man in Devon and a woman in Yorkshire met the same format, the same oaths, and the same penalties for false testimony. Evidence looked different from today's standards. Courts relied on sworn statements, character reputation, and the weight of community knowledge. Compurgation, supporting oaths by neighbors, could tip a decision when facts were thin. Written charters, boundary marks, and witness lists mattered in land cases, but many trials turned on whether 12 local men believed an account. Truth emerged from consensus shaped by status and standing as much as by objects produced in court. Older methods did linger. Ordeals by hot iron or cold water had once settled doubt under the eye of clergy, but as clerical involvement narrowed, those practices faded. Juries replaced ordeal with structured inquiry. Panels of local men swore to tell what they knew, named suspects, and then judged the case presented. Presentment juries brought accusations. Trial juries weighed them. This moved decision-making from ritual to deliberation, even if the same social pressures still influenced outcomes. Punishments aimed to warn as much as wound. Stocks and pillories stood in market squares where crowds gathered. Whipping, branding, and ear cropping marked offenders whose crimes the community needed to remember. Executions were public and formal, with sheriffs accountable for carrying out sentences. Fines fell heavily, and failure to pay could lead to seizure of goods or imprisonment in town gaols that relied on fees for food and bedding. Status bent the law's arc. Free men, villains, clergy, and nobles did not face identical risks. Benefit of clergy shielded tonsured offenders from secular penalties and sent them to ecclesiastical courts known for different procedures and sanctions. Lords leveraged influence to reduce fines. Poor defendants lacked sureties to await trial outside a cell. Women's legal standing varied by marital status, affecting property claims and the weight granted their testimony. Writing fixed memory and expanded control. Plea rolls, fee to fines, and gaol delivery records listed names, places, verdicts, and sums owed. Clerks copied outcomes that sheriffs then enforced, while repeat offenders accumulated documentary shadows that followed them from session to session. Keeping the record made the system portable and comparable, and it strengthened the hand that held the seal. Belief and law mingled in unexpected ways. Some courts even tried animals for destroying crops or causing death, a practice that shows how moral order, divine judgment, and legal theater could meet in one place. By 1400, procedures, circuits, and records bound England into a legal web sturdy enough that most quarrels found a path through writ, jury, and judgment rather than through a blade. Trade fattened towns and then carried death along the same roads and sea lanes. In the summer of 1348, ships reached southern ports with cargoes and crew already ill, and the sickness moved inland faster than officials could count the dead. Carters, sailors, and peddlers became unwitting links from quay to market square to parish lane. so places tied closely to commerce felt the first blows. Within months, infection had crossed shires and rivers, and the timing of outbreaks followed the rhythm of fairs and harvest as people gathered and scattered again. The speed stunned communities. Whole households fell in days, leaving doors unbarred and tools where work stopped. Fields lay uncut, mills lacked hands, and monasteries lost the brothers who tended the sick and sang the offices at dawn. Parish priests walked a route of last confessions until they too were taken, and replacements came slowly, sometimes from far away and with uneven training. Village officers who kept accounts and called juries vanished, so manorial courts failed to meet, lists went unfinished, and rents went uncollected for a season or more. Burials strained to keep pace. Churchyards filled, and the trench became a practical answer when gravediggers themselves were ill. Processions and wakes faded under the weight of numbers and the fear of closeness. Parish records shrank to names and dates with little comment because clerks had no time for more. Mortuary fees and offerings dropped with the mourners, leaving churches short of income just as repairs and charity needs rose. Loss reshaped work. With perhaps half the labor force gone, surviving tenants pressed for wages, shorter terms, and better plots. Harvests could not wait for old customs, so lords paid cash to bring in grain and relaxed rules to keep tenants from walking away. Stewards counted available oxen, tallied able hands, and rented out demesne blocks when they could not staff them. Villages redrew strip allocations, merged holdings of the dead, and brought in kin from other parishes to keep houses from falling empty. Resistance met record. Councils issued orders to freeze pay at earlier rates and to require service where custom had demanded it. And they named officials to hunt for runaways. Past systems tried to fix people to parishes, and fines punished those who broke the rules. Enforcement landed unevenly. Some areas complied for a time. Others bent the rules quietly because barns and fields demanded bodies more than paper demanded obedience. Over time, money wages spread, and hired service replaced earlier labor dues on many estates. Faith took blows and found adjustments. Processions, fasts, and prayers multiplied. Yet the dying continued, and that gap planted doubt. Some sought blame in outsiders and faced punishment for it. Others turned to local saints, penitential groups, or vows of charity and repair. Monasteries admitted new recruits, but the loss of trained members shortened learning, and parish clergy varied more in preparation than before. The mask with a bird's beak stuffed with herbs to fend off bad air, shows how people tried to understand disease by smell and season when causes stayed hidden. By 1400, the map of society looked different. Fewer people meant more land per head, higher bargaining power for workers, and greater movement for families willing to travel. Lords sold privileges to raise cash. Towns courted migrants to revive trade, and contracts in coin replaced older services across wide regions. Feudal ties still existed, but daily life leaned toward wage work, leases, and written agreements that outlasted memory. The plague cut numbers, the decades after it rewired how people worked, prayed, and claimed their share. Recovery did not restore the old order. After the first waves of plague, some regions refilled quickly while others stayed thinly settled, and that unevenness exposed how brittle feudal obligations had become. Stewards who once scheduled fixed labor days now counted available hands and found gaps they could not close by custom alone. Lords tried to call in arrears, tighten controls, and reassert duties, But yields, rents, and headcounts no longer aligned with a system calibrated for denser villages and predictable seasons. Labor remained scarce for decades, and scarcity shifted leverage. Tenants bargained for better terms, asked for payment in coin, and chose employers instead of bound service when they could. Harvests forced concessions. Cash wages appeared where none had been offered, meal allowances sweetened agreements, and hiring fairs drew workers from neighboring parishes. Written service contracts set hours, tool provision, and penalties for leaving early, and those papers outlasted memories that once anchored custom. Even where statutes tried to hold wages down, enforcement faltered when barns needed filling. Estate management followed the money. Demesne blocks that once relied on compulsory labor moved into leasehold. A lord might let a large farm to a single tenant for a fixed rent, or break land into smaller parcels to spread risk. Covenants specified repairs, rotations, and stock numbers, and failure incurred forfeits. The shift reduced administrative burden, fewer reeves to supervise, fewer tools to maintain, fewer oxen to feed. Accounts changed too as bailiffs tracked rent schedules, arrears, and entry fines rather than days of plowing or reaping. Coin settled more arguments than oaths. Entry fees, harriets, and tallage converted into cash sums or disappeared under new arrangements. Commutation, paying money in place of labor, turned up in manor rolls year after year until it seemed normal. Debt records thickened, notarial instruments multiplied, and seals traveled in purses with the same weight as a lord's word had carried a century earlier. With money came mobility. Tenants sold surplus grain, bought better gear, and moved for opportunity with less fear of losing standing. Pressure built from both directions. When officials pushed to revive older obligations, villages organized refusals, appealed to charters, or delayed en masse. Urban workers struck for higher rates and shorter hours, and councils weighed order against the risk of stalls sitting empty. Some protests spilled into violence, but many were negotiated standoffs that produced written concessions, new fee scales, or limits on fines. Each small settlement set a precedent another community could cite. Meanwhile, towns tightened their hold on wealth. Merchants financed cloth production in the countryside, extended credit, and drew labor into wage networks that bypassed manorial control. Urban courts adjudicated contracts, and guild rules protected trained workers who delivered consistent quality. Rural households took spinning, fulling, and seasonal tasks that tied village time to city clocks. As trade taxes filled civic coffers, councils gained leverage over neighboring lords who needed loans for campaigns or repairs. Noble power frayed where war met arithmetic. Hiring professional soldiers cost more than calling short-term service, and plate, horses, and artillery drained treasuries. Retinues shrank or demanded arrears, tenants resisted extra levies, and pawned plate or mortgaged land patched budgets. Some families married for dowries that covered debts. Others sold peripheral estates and retreated to core holdings that they could actually police. By the 15th century, many who would have been bound lived as tenants by lease or at will, owing rent rather than service and choosing employers with an eye to wages. Their grandparents' world of fixed days and inherited duties felt distant. By 1450, the framework had not snapped in a single moment. It thinned and spread into agreements, receipts, and seals. creating a landscape where movement, bargaining, and written terms defined how people held land and earned their keep. The ground had shifted already. Obligations converted to cash, leases replaced service, and local loyalty stretched thin. Into that loosened framework stepped magnates with claims, grievances, and household troops who answered to badges rather than to the crown. Disputes over succession turned from lawsuits into marches. Estates that had once funded harvest labor and chapel lights now paid captains, archers, and men-at-arms. When a summons went out, tenants weighed safety, wages, and kinship before riding, because a wrong choice could cost a farm or a life. Weak kingship magnified the problem. Councils split, favorites rose and fell, and royal orders competed with the instructions of regional lords who dominated shire courts and musters. Retainers wore liveries in open defiance of earlier bans, and castles that had served as administrative hubs became rallying points. Sheriffs hesitated to levy fines against men protected by Duke's badge. In some counties, justice terms paused while rival hosts camped within a day's march, and merchants waited to move goods until roads felt clear of patrols. Conflict stretched across decades and trained people to expect interruption. Harvests were rushed, bridges burned, and loans called in to fund the next levy. Households kept two sets of accounts, one for rents and wages, another for plate pawned to arm retainers. Priories bargained for safe conduct letters so carts could pass between manors. Towns fortified gates and demanded oaths from any force seeking entry. Loyalty narrowed to households and patrons. It could switch after a defeat, because survival meant recognizing the next paymaster. Battles came as sharp breaks in a long grind. Forces met on hedged fields and ridges where archers could work and where mud slowed horsemen. Captains chose ground for wind and sun, set stakes to blunt charges, and held reserves of billmen to finish a wavering line. Losses hit hardest among leading families. A single day could erase heirs, uncles, and cousins, scattering estates among minors, widows, and distant kin. Forfeitures followed defeated factions, and land passed quickly to men whose loyalty bought them royal favor. As bloodlines thinned, the social map redrew. Grants rewarded new servants. Wardships placed young heirs under guardians who steered marriages and revenues. Escheated lands swelled the crown's gift list. Lawyers and clerks who managed transfers and defended titles gained standing. Lesser gentry advanced by serving as commissioners, castellans, and receivers, building careers on paperwork as much as on prowess. On the field, infantry mattered more each year. Archers with longbows shaped openings. Bills and pikes held ground and crushed attempts to break lines. Handguns and small artillery appeared in trains that rumbled behind carts of arrows and spare bowstrings. Armor thickened into full plate for those who could pay, but the decisive push came from coordinated foot and missiles rather than from a charge of lances. The knight's image stood, his primacy ebbed. A decisive victory did not erase memory, but it steadied rule. Confiscations settled debts to supporters, and pardons folded former enemies into service. Councils resumed regular sessions, treasurers counted customs without interruption, and sheriffs held assizes on schedule. Magnates trimmed retinues, and royal progress could cross shires without negotiating every bridge. One fate captured the shift. A defeated king fell in battle and went to a plain grave without honors, his bones lost to records until rediscovery in a later century. The symbol fit the moment. By 1485, institutions, royal courts, shire administration, borough councils, survived, yet the scaffolding of inherited service that had sustained them receded. Power ran through contracts, offices, and gunpowder, and families rose by managing revenue and law as much as by holding a line under a banner. Medieval Britain had been shaped by collapse, conquest, faith, and survival, leaving behind a world that slowly transformed into the foundations of modern England. If you enjoyed this journey through power, struggle, and change, make sure to subscribe for more deep, story-driven history.